All right. So I'm going to actually continue more or less where we left off together last week. And last week I started talking about the concept of zero sum racial thinking. And I want to really elaborate that concept today and talk about its capacity to illuminate what is happening in American politics right now. And obviously, there's a lot happening in American politics right now, as I'm sure many of you have been following. The Congress considered, they had a Monday deadline for considering a bipartisan infrastructure bill that passed the Senate in the summer. In the end, progressive Democrats, so-called, we'll talk more about that concept a little bit later, resisted. They had said all along that they would not vote on that standalone bill unless others of their priority had been passed in a separate bill, and those two bills could be considered together, coupled. And Nancy Pelosi tried in the middle of the week to decouple those bills, failed on Thursday, failed yesterday, and she and Joe Biden, presumably other members of the Democratic leadership team, concluded yesterday that they would have to wait, that they would have to come to Congress, come to the House of Representatives with both of these bills hammered out and get them considered together. Some people are wringing their hands and suggesting this is a major defeat, that the kind of infighting that's occurring in the Democratic Party shows that it is incapable of legislating. I think it's a little early to make that call. And I don't want to spend a ton of time today micro analyzing the politics of the Biden policy priorities before we've seen how this actually all plays out. And just as a reminder, if it does turn out a month from now that a substantial portion of this gets passed, then it will have been the most consequential expansion of federal governmental responsibilities in several generations. And that will be true even if the price tag is half or less than half of what Joe Biden and the Democratic leadership had hoped for, which was $3.5 trillion. So when you couple, let's say Joe Manchin holds the line at $1.5 trillion with another roughly $1 trillion in the bipartisan infrastructure bill, with $1.9 trillion in the initial stimulus bill, you still have an enormous expansion of federal spending, and more importantly, a much more vigorous role for the federal government in caring for and protecting its citizens, in proactively, if belatedly, working to fend off climate change, in perhaps delivering to many citizens what you might call a dignity dividend, in a situation in which many Americans have seen, with the contraction of the role of the federal government, their lives become much more precarious, much more difficult, much more vulnerable, and therefore a feeling of neglect and aggrievement on the part of many citizens, that this might possibly reverse some of that. So having said all of that, I want not to focus on the give and take, the to and fro of this week, so much as on the more historical perspective. And I think the concept of zero-sum racial thinking in a political world where party has become a proxy for race is extremely helpful in thinking about the deeper stakes of the current political debate. And so to be as clear as possible, starting with the concept of zero-sum racial thinking, I'm building on the work of Heather McGhee. And as I've introduced her to you before, Heather McGhee is the former head of the think tank and policy advocacy research group, Demos, headquartered out of New York, that has spent much of the last 20 years lobbying for legislation in Congress that is the opposite of zero-sum which is often called positive sum or net gain legislation. And the crucial contrast here is between, if you will, playing Monopoly, right? And when you play Monopoly, if I get more money, it is to your disadvantage. That allows me to buy more properties, build more hotels on my properties, and take more of your money until I bankrupt you. And as opposed to that zero sum model, what is good for one is bad for the other. What is good for one social group is bad for another social group. There's a fundamental competitive dynamic that is perhaps currently stabilized in hierarchy. And if you destabilize that hierarchy, the group that was previously doing less well off may do better, but it will be at the cost of the group that was previously doing better off. Zero sum thinking. As opposed to that, you can think of the model not of playing Monopoly, but playing in an orchestra, where if I play well, it is going to improve the quality of our overall performance, perhaps inspire other people around me to play well, perhaps lead them to see an interpretation of the music that leads them to play the music as well as I'm playing it. And if you play better, perhaps that will also inspire me to play better. But even if it doesn't, our collective performance will be better as a result of you playing better. And so in a positive sum environment, the individuals or groups are not competing with each other, but what improves one often improves the other. And that's in part because those improvements stem from and allow for cooperation between the groups. And so the alternative to the current social order in which one group is advantaged and another group is disadvantaged is a social order in which both groups are equally advantaged. They cooperate with each other, and as a result of that cooperation, they are able to improve their overall situation. As opposed to fighting for a bigger slice of the pie, they grow the pie so that everybody's slice is bigger. And Heather McGhee points out that in her practically 20 years of working on legislation in Washington, D.C., that the dominant concern, the thing that she continually had to watch out for, was the white moderate voter. For the most part, she was trying to convince Democrats as opposed to Republicans. It's a relatively progressive organization, Demos, she was working for. And she was trying to convince them that this change in healthcare, or this change in housing policy, or this change in infrastructure would be good for everyone. And she was constantly running up against, but my white moderate supporters won't go for that. And she believes that this is a index, a sign of zero sum racial thinking, that essentially white moderates see policies that benefit African Americans, Latino Americans, Asian Americans, recent immigrants, as a threat to their status and standing in this country, as a handout, as something that goes disproportionately to people of color. In fact, most of the federal government's expenditures, I want to say all, but I can't clearly back that up, so I'll just say most, benefit white Americans more than any other group, and that's because white Americans are the largest group in our society. Nevertheless, much of what the federal government does is perceived by many to disproportionately benefit racial minorities, and many white Americans therefore oppose expanding the role of the federal government or the things that the federal government currently does, because they see it as being for them and not for us. And they see a fundamental competition, a trade-off between us and them. And so The power of this concept, I think, is to illuminate the current trap, the binds we find ourselves in, the way they prevent us from accomplishing things as a society that would be good for nearly everyone, because the hold of zero-sum thinking prevents us from seeing the advantages. And the us here is primarily white Americans, primarily moderate or conservative white Americans, and that in fact that leads us to oppose legislation that would be good not only for them but for us. That's the argument of this book, The Sum of Us, and it's wonderfully done with reams of research, lots of data, but also really interesting narratives and metaphors. The one that's on the book cover and that got a lot of attention is the metaphor of the swimming pool, which of course is a concrete policy issue. Many cities, it appears that most municipalities in the United States, when ordered in the late 40s and early 50s to integrate their municipal swimming pools, chose to close them, fill them in with dirt and concrete, stop providing that service to their white citizens rather than sharing them with their Black citizens, right? And that this is a clear example of the way in which zero sum hurts all of us. And obviously, the counterfactual to consider would be if we had integrated those pools. And if then whites had continued to enjoy the public service of the swimming pools, what might that have done to their attitudes about government? But also if those swimming pools had become spaces of segregated recreation, what that might have done to race relations in the United States. And so then to come back to the central concept of the title, I want to consider not just zero-sum racial thinking, but zero-sum racial thinking in a political world where party has become a proxy for race. And again, to be as clear as possible, the evidence I think is very clear. I'm going to show you some of that evidence today. It's very much evidence I've already shown you, but I think viewing it in this light will help to see its implications in a world where we know a lot about your racial identity based on your party affiliation. And please note, I said racial identity more than race per se, because it still is the case that the Democrats get a lot of white votes. It is the case that the Republicans get almost exclusively white votes, and the Democrats get almost all of the non-white voters, right? And so already we know something about the racial composition of these two partisan coalitions. But in addition to that, I want to suggest that zero-sum racial thinking is located almost exclusively in the Republican Party right now. Not exclusively, right? And so part of the problem the Democrats have is that there probably are still some Democrats who owe their margin of victory to some people who vote for them but still subscribe to zero-sum racial thinking, but that the vast majority of the white voters who vote for the Democratic Party nationally have overcome this way of thinking and see that either it is their duty of justice and their duty of civility to fellow citizens to support racial justice and equality, or even better, they recognize that by working with a diverse coalition, everyone can benefit. And so in the world in which we live in, the social moment of the 21st century, it is basically socially impermissible to be an explicit racist. Now, some of that has been eroded over the last 4 years, some of what are called conversational constraints. You can't tell racist jokes, you can't use derogatory racial terms or stereotypes. Some of that has actually been relaxed in much of the right-wing media environment and right-wing politics. But nevertheless, it is still the case that you can lose your job, you can lose your admission to college, you can lose your friends, and you can even have relatives who will stop speaking with you if you are overtly racist in the 21st century. If you are supremacist, hateful, derogatory, you can very quickly become persona non grata in many circles. But that is not true for partisanship, right? It is still absolutely fine to be vehemently opposed to the other party. And I'm sure many of us do this all the time. And when being vehemently opposed to the other party, in a sense, serves as a proxy for race, attitudes about race, racial identity, we're in a world where it is possible in a sanitized way to still talk about race without talking about race. And so now let me get into the details of the lecture. And as I said to you last week, and I will say it to you again this week, there are a variety of big issues percolating in American politics right now. Maybe I should say simmering, and they could frankly hit a boiling point at any moment. And I'll talk with you a little bit about the pandemic just for a moment, and polarization and the pandemic. And the good news on the pandemic is that although it is obviously catastrophic for our society, we passed the grim threshold of 700,000 dead this week. It is also the case that this virus seems to come in spikes and troughs. And it does appear that the late summer spike that has gripped this country is receding at present, right? And obviously that's good news. And it does appear that vaccinations are going up. They are going up in part because of the fear that the new Delta variant has spread in many places with low rates of vaccination. It has gone up because of mandates in workplaces and schools, forcing people to choose between their job or their position on liberty with regards to vaccination. And many people have chosen their jobs, right? And so what we can also see is the vaccination rate is still far below where it should be, particularly for full vaccination of people 12 years old and up. It's only about 2/3 of our society. There are many places in the world today that have the kind of access that the United States has to the vaccine, where it's 3/4 or higher. You may have seen Portugal has basically just said, we've reached full vaccination, that there's nothing left to do in our society. We have the lowest rate of vaccination in the developed world. And that is because, as odd and sad as it is, this has become a partisan issue. And so to begin with, as you can see, when you look at vaccination rates, the redder the state, the higher the support for Trump, the lower the rate of vaccination. Now this is not the only factor that's determining the transmission of the virus, but it's certainly extremely important. And I then want to call your attention to this very grim diagram. And this breaks it down on the county level. The county level is the more accurate level to look at COVID data on, because there are, of course, blue counties in red states and red counties in blue states. So if you look at the county level, you get more precise information. And what you can see is that from July through September, the partisan gap in COVID deaths has really opened into being a chasm. And that this is a sad inversion of what was the case in the early months of the pandemic. And I will just point out to you very briefly that there's there's a history to be told here. It's a little early to be telling it, but there's a history in which Donald Trump and key members of his administration decided at some point in the spring of 2020 that the people who were dying of COVID were primarily not his voters, not his party, not his people, that it was affecting African Americans and Latinos. Please note, we're coming back to the overlap of race and partisanship, that those were the workers who had to continue to go to work in unsafe conditions in meat houses and fulfillment centers, that didn't own cars, that had to take public transportation, that lived in multi-generational dense urban housing, right? And all of those risk factors meant that this became essentially a problem for blue voters. And of course, Donald Trump was facing re-election as a reasonably unpopular president with a reasonably strong economy. And in his administration, it was decided that it would be political suicide to close the economy down, to take the precautions that public health officials were advising. And so they did it, right? They didn't do this as national policy. This is the origin of the partisan split. And the irony is that a year and a half later, the gap is inverted, right? And in a sense, this is perfectly predictable, but nevertheless, I think it's important to situate it within that history. Now, going back, we will talk soon about what's happening in Texas with abortion, but I'll just note for a moment that essentially women in Texas cannot get abortions, that after 50 years of there being a constitutionally mandated, federally guaranteed right to abortion, right? And believe me, you know, it has been contested over that period. We are now entering a period in which it may be the case that there will no longer be a 50 state constitutionally mandated availability of abortion. We will have to see what the Supreme Court does to this, but so far they've let stand the Texas legislation, and it will be emulated by many other states. It could be pretty soon that more than half the states in the United States will be states where it is difficult to impossible for a woman to secure an abortion. And I'm not talking right now about the morality of that. I'm talking just about the fact that this represents a seismic shift, a sea change in an issue that is extremely important to the way in which we navigate procreation and procreative freedom in America in the 2020s. So something to return to, but something to note, and something that may have implications, frankly, for the gender partisan alignment in addition to the racial partisan alignment. Third issue that I do want to focus more on today, and that's to do with voting rights, redistricting, and ballot access. And as you are well aware, the 2020 census results have now been released, at least the ones that are relevant to political redistricting. And there is every indication that states that have a so-called Republican trifecta, where the Republican Party is in charge of both houses of the legislature and the governorship, that those states will engage in aggressive partisan districting. And in a society with the racial partisan split that we have, that is in many cases a proxy for racial gerrymandering. And in addition to that, there are two other issues here. One of them is ballot access, and the other is the mechanisms by which the electoral results are counted, registered, conveyed, right? And there's increasing efforts to meddle with that, supported by the so-called big lie, the idea that the election of 2020 was stolen from Donald Trump, given to Joe Biden through corruption and other nefarious means, and that the result is that the Republican Party needs to be prepared for this to happen again. And the right way to do that is to have more partisan officials in charge of the way in which elections are counted, registered, transmitted, and to have those partisan officials have greater liberty to override the way in which the ballots are counted in case there is suspicion of corruption. And again, we'll come back to this, but note the demographic background to all of this. I referred to the 2020 census and its implications for redistricting. But the other thing that the 2020 census shows is that we are becoming a more diverse society, that we are less than 65% white, something around there, 45% people of color, many recent immigrants, and that the efforts to restrict ballot access, to gerrymander, and potentially to engage in partisan oversight or tampering in elections is related to the sense that this demographic trend line is hostile to the electoral prospects of the Republican Party, and they need to take extreme measures to change the rules of the game to prevent the demographic transformation from translating into proportionate political power at the national level. Fourth and finally, the issue that we've been talking about together, and that has been very much the focus of the national news for the last 10 days at least. I think I started lecturing with you about this in the beginning of September, right? And the idea that we've got an infrastructure bill, a big Biden Build Back Better bill, a debt ceiling, and dramatic overall legislative agenda having to do with the role that the federal government plays in our lives as a source of support, as a safety net, as a regulatory authority, as the institution that has the power to mitigate the damage that climate change will do to us and to try to forestall the worst aspects of climate change. This is all in play right now. And I let me go forward to looking at the details. You will be familiar with this, I believe, right? Which is to say, right, that there's a bipartisan infrastructure bill, and I'm putting the conservative $550 billion price tag on it. It could be as much as a little bit over $1 trillion, depending on how you account for the funds. And this has been coupled by progressives in Congress with a much larger bill, sometimes called a safety net bill, sometimes called the Build Back Better bill. I might refer to it as the kitchen sink bill. And we have gone through together all that it contains several times. If you remember, this is the pie diagram. And yes, there are 100 little pieces to that pie, because there is so much laden into this single piece of legislation, right? And this is not the way, frankly, a healthy legislature functions. It doesn't bundle everything together and do it all at once. But given the many veto points, given the difficulty of legislating as a result, given the highly compressed time frame, with the Democrats anticipating that their very narrow hold on power may be gone in a year as a result of the November 2022 elections. And the worry that as those elections approach, legislating will get all the more difficult. The approach that Biden and Schumer and Pelosi, the Democratic leadership, hit upon was to bundle this all together as one huge piece of legislation. Some analysts have worried that it's going to sink under its own weight, and they may still be proven right. But I think they would have to then persuade us that the better approach would have been to break it up and consider it piece by piece. And I think that the judgment here that that would be impossible to do in the current legislative environment, that if you broke off the child and family support aspect of this legislation, we would have spent all of the fall arguing just about that. That might not have got done, but then none of the rest of this would have got done. So that is right, the first two items on this agenda. And note that there was a deadline of last Monday, self-imposed by the Democrats in the House of Representatives, that came and went, and that Nancy Pelosi said, well, we'll get it done on Thursday, and failed, and said, well, we'll get it done on Friday. And then after extensive meetings with Joe Biden and the leadership of the Senate and various members of the Senate and the House, Pelosi and Biden concluded that they couldn't get the bipartisan infrastructure bill passed unless they got the safety net bill passed, and that they had not made enough progress to convince the progressive Democrats. I'm going to call that phrase into question in just a moment, but let's use it for now. The progressive Democrats wouldn't come on board without more progress, without perhaps a second bill to consider. And to be clear, the progressive Democrats know that the moderates in the House will certainly vote for the bipartisan infrastructure bill, but it's far from assured that they will also vote for the larger safety net bill. And so the progressives see bringing the two together, holding the two together, as the best prospects for getting both of them passed, right? The fact that they couldn't pass the second led them to actually stand their ground, say, we don't care about the 9/27 deadline, we will wait. We'd rather risk getting nothing done than doing only the infrastructure bill. And I want to say a little bit more about this, but I want to be as clear as possible. These were self-imposed deadlines, right? There was nothing in the nature of the legislative calendar that said, if you didn't get it done in September, you're never going to get it done. And so the fact that they retreated from that deadline, I don't think is an indication of failure yet. It's an indication that this is complicated, that there's a lot of negotiation to be done, that there are big differences within the party, and that they have to continue working to common ground. But frankly, that's what legislating is like. And I happen to have been reading some of the history of the New Deal recently. And if you look at that history, it was sloppy, messy. There was perhaps less media attention focused on the details of it in the first half of the 1930s than there is in the first half of the 2020s. And so we were perhaps less aware of it at the time. But nevertheless, when we do the history of the New Deal, we don't focus on the legislative battles for the most part. We focus on the outcomes. And so I do think there's a real possibility that there will be some legislation that will be significant, perhaps the most significant legislation of this kind passed since Johnson's presidency, that occurs in this Congress. I'm not assuring you that it will. I think there's also a reasonable chance that it would fail or will fail. And I think if you were just looking at the numbers, the tenuousness of the position the Democrats are in, it's quite unlikely that they would get something ambitious done. And yet we are in many respects on the cusp of it. And even if the bill comes down to 1.5 trillion, which it's been revealed is the figure Joe Manchin has given, Kristen Sinema appears still not to be on the record about what she considers to be the maximum figure. And who knows, it might come up a little bit from 1.5 trillion when all is said and done. But even if it hits at 1.5 trillion, it is a landmark watershed event, especially when coupled with another trillion here and another 1.9 trillion in the original COVID coronavirus pandemic stimulus package from the beginning of Biden's presidency. By the way, let's not forget that Congress managed to get the government funded. The government didn't close down the day before yesterday. And that this is because Congress was willing to decouple the debt ceiling from the funding bill. The debt ceiling, right, the capacity of the government to borrow money in order to pay its bills will be exceeded in the middle of October, maybe in just a couple of weeks, if it is not lifted, raised by Congress. And the Republicans have indicated no willingness to do that. When the Democrats said, okay, well, let's consider the funding bill on its own, they got enough support to go forward with that. And it's now extended through the middle of December. But let's not lose track of how important the debt ceiling is. There may be some very creative bookkeeping measures done to keep the government paying its obligations. But this is a potential trigger of a global economic crisis. And the position of the Republicans, which is that they will not support the raising of the debt ceiling, that if the Democrats are going to govern unilaterally, then they've got to solve this problem unilaterally, might be a respectable parliamentary gamesmanship position if they were exclusively focused on these two bills and just said, look, we've given you a bipartisan infrastructure bill. Now you're going to do unilaterally this huge other bill. We're not going to cooperate with that. We disagree with that. But having said that, please remember that the other part of the agenda that the Democrats are trying to get done is a federal voting rights bill that restricts or even eliminates partisan gerrymandering, that regulates some of the ballot access issues, that makes it more difficult for there to be partisan meddling in the way in which ballots are counted, registered, and transmitted. And so there is, I think, a much more, frankly, sinister thing going on here, which is not only do the Republicans not want this bill to pass, they don't want the voting rights bill to pass. And that is because their strategy for winning re-election involves changing the rules of the game, frankly, to advantage a group of the population that is shrinking in a party that nationally only attracts minority support to be able to compete and win in national elections. And so I believe that, again, seeing zero-sum racial politics as behind some of the current maneuvers is extremely important. Now, in terms of the politics of all of this, are the Democrats coming apart? And as I say, there's a lot of hand-wringing. I really don't think we know. It does appear that there has been meaningful progress in these negotiations over the last few days. One of the advantages of having a late September deadline is that it has forced concerted negotiation, a lot of political attention being paid to this. They are not there yet. They may never get there. This whole thing may collapse, in which case then, yes, the Democrats did fall apart and the negotiations failed. But I want to point out that that's far from fait accompli, that I'm still inclined to think that there's a likelihood that there will be some success, in part because the fate of a Democratic president, the fate of a Democratic majority depends on this. And so, to be clear, I've shared this with you now for the last few weeks. I don't like doing the kind of horse race popularity metrics in the middle of a non-election year, but I think actually right now it's important to see that Joe Biden's support has continued to slide, right? I thought maybe it was stabilizing a week or two ago, but it appears that it's still going down. It's still unstable. This is not disastrous territory. This is much better than Donald Trump was throughout most of his presidency. This is about where Barack Obama was at this point in his presidency. And so this does not preclude Joe Biden having a successful first term or maybe even a second term as president. But having said that, it does indicate, especially when we look at the details, the fact that Biden is losing support from independents, from women, from African Americans, that key components of the coalition that he needs to reassemble to have any chance of controlling Congress in 2022, any chance of a Democrat still being in the White House in 2024, that coalition is beginning to fray. And that's what's driving his declining approval rating. The Democrats need a win, right? And so they need a win for Joe Biden. They need a win for their own electoral prospects next year. And I hope that that will be strong enough to force them to negotiate a eventual settlement to the current impasse they're at. But having said that, and this is where I want to concentrate for a minute, the reason that we didn't get the infrastructure bill passed this week is because the so-called progressive Democrats finally, quote, flex their muscle, right? And so let me now call into question the idea of progressive Democrats. That suggests that this is the left wing, the fringe of the Democratic Party. But I think it's worthwhile noting that the majority of the Democratic members of Congress belong to the so-called progressive coalition. This is really the center of the Democratic Party. And so this is a large number of elected officials within Congress. And this is a group that has been mainly very cooperative. And one of the things that's sometimes said about Congress these days is that it's always a mistake to vote or bet against Nancy Pelosi. And she's been very good at delivering for the Democrats going all the way back to Barack Obama's presidency. But that's in part because the progressive wing of her party, to which she mainly belongs, has very often shown a strong willingness to compromise. And that stopped this week. They said very clearly, this is not going to happen unless we get what we want to. And so I now go back for a moment to Heather McGhee's observation that the wall she ran into again and again in making the case for a progressive public policy agenda had to do with white moderate voters and those who represented them essentially saying, my voters won't go for this and still vote for me. And it may be that what we're seeing this week and at this moment in this Congress is, if not the end, at least the diminished power of the white moderate voter to essentially veto legislation that a substantial portion of the Democratic Party prefers, and that this may change the dynamic in the in the Democratic Party. And in a sense, you may see that it's already happened. Joe Biden, a career moderate, is pursuing an agenda that makes him look much more like LBJ or FDR than like Obama or Clinton. And Nancy Pelosi is no longer able to rein in the progressives and get them to support what the moderates want. And so this may be changing the internal dynamics of the Democratic Party. And in a moment, I'm going to say more about this, but I think part of what has happened, first with Barack Obama, then with Donald Trump, is an increased sorting of our voters. And it's a partisan sorting, and it has a lot to do with race and racial identity, whether you are white or someone who is white and considers the growing diversity of our country a threat, or whether you're a person of color, or what's sometimes called an ally, a white voter who sees cooperation with and justice for, equality for people of color as essential to the future of this country, right, has also come to be aligned with how progressive you want the party to be. And so the fact that the Democratic Party has had for a long time Dixiecrats, Southern Democrats, Blue Dog Democrats in its midst has moderated what it will do. And the fact that there are fewer and fewer and fewer of those Democrats left is making the progressive wing, or maybe I should just say the mainstream of the Democratic Party, more powerful today. Now, one more thing to note about this, which is although the progressive mainstream of the Democratic Party is much larger and more powerful today, the Democrats still cannot legislate without Joe Manchin, Kristen Sinema coming along. And so the electoral math is hard and brutal, and they will not be able to get their $3.5 trillion, right? I've been saying for weeks that's not going to happen. Will they be able to get Manchin and Sinema to budge above 1.5 trillion? And I will just very briefly call your attention to this diagram again and say that the best chance is going to be if you start pointing to, okay, so look at what the child tax credit has done to poverty, has done to food vulnerability for children in our society over the last 6 months as it's been rolled out. Do you really want to cut that? Okay, then let's look at affordable housing. Let's look at in-home care for the elderly. Let's look at universal pre-K. Which of these priorities do you want to eliminate from this budget? Senators Manchin and Sinema. And you know, it may turn out that they'll be willing to eliminate some of them. It may turn out that they'll say, let's do this for 5 years instead of 10 years. It may turn out, and I think this is perhaps the most likely scenario, that they will say, let's means test this. If you make over $100,000 a year, you don't need child tax credit, right? And I'm not sure that's a bad argument, right? It does get us a little bit more back into zero sum, right? Because at that point, it's not a universal benefit. And some of the people in our society who are more affluent will be forced to pay taxes in order to provide a benefit for people who are less well off. That doesn't seem to me to be unjust or unfair. It does seem to me to be politically perhaps a little bit more contentious, but we'll just have to see how all of this plays out. I just wanted to indicate to you where it is that there might be some leverage to come up from $1.5 trillion, right? And I will just point out finally that we are still 5 million jobs down from where we were at the onset of the pandemic, that there are growing signs that the current spike in coronavirus has done further damage to the economy, or at least stalled the recovery. And this occurs in a context of economic changes that have been going on for 50 plus years that have hollowed out the middle class in this society. and a contracting role of government precisely at the time that those economic changes are occurring. So it's not just the pandemic caused recession, it's the longer term context of deindustrialization and disinvestment. And one way to look at the Biden agenda, and I want to be as clear about this as possible, is that it would not only do things for voters and citizens who have been primarily excluded from the benefits the federal government has created in the past, that is to say, African Americans, Latinos, recent immigrants. It also would be, I believe, a dignity dividend for the white working class. People who say in the title of one currently popular book, we're still here, even though you're ignoring us, even though you've done nothing for us, even though the agenda of the government for the last 30 years has been to pay attention to people other than us. We're still here. And this would be a legislative agenda that says, yes, you are. And there is stuff we can do to help you, to ease some of the difficulties that have accompanied the transition, to help you to keep your homes or stay in your rental units, to help you keep your health care, to help you put food on the table for your children. This agenda would help white working class people and people of color. It is a positive sum as opposed to a zero sum legislative agenda. All right, so now I want to spend a few minutes talking with you about some information I've shared with you recently, and to ask you to view this in light of the concept of the split at the partisan level between a party that primarily continues to view the United States as a zero-sum racial society, and a party that increasingly sees the possibility of there being benefits to interracial cooperation. And so we start with the changing composition of Congress, right? I mean, Congress is still wider than the country, but is more diverse than it's ever been in its history. And that diversity is concentrated almost exclusively in the Democratic Party, much more marginal to the Republican Party, much more in the House. And so when I say that the progressive coalition or faction is digging its heels in the Republican Party, I did it again, I'm sorry, in the Democratic Party, I think part of what you need to see is who is in the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, and that these are newly elected, more diverse, more progressive representatives who are saying, look, for a decade we've been electing progressives and they haven't been legislating in a progressive way. We just kicked some of those people out in primaries. We are a new coalition and we're not going to do what they did. This is, in many respects, the newly elected African Americans, Hispanics, Asians, even some Native Americans in Congress, and they're almost exclusively on the Democratic side of the aisle. This is familiar, you know this at this point, right? The reason the Democrats are diverse in Congress is because the Democratic electorate is diverse. The reason the Republicans are almost 90% white is because their electorate is 90% white. You know also that the big lie, which is being used to justify so much of the access restriction to the ballot, etc., is very widely believed in our society. 25% of the electorate believes that the election was stolen, and that goes up when we consider Republicans only up to around 70%. And when we look at what those people believe, a substantial proportion of them believes that the election was so illegitimate that the use of force is justified to overthrow the federal government of the United States and replace the current duly elected president with the previous president. right? And that is nearly 10% of Americans who believe that, according to this survey data. These people, the 10%, and I'm sorry, it's actually, this is now going back to the 25% who believe that Trump was not actually booted out of office by the electorate, also believe in the great replacement theory, that African American and Hispanic will eventually have more rights than whites as a result of the changing demographics, the changing composition of our government. And again, this is as explicit an indication of the idea that zero-sum thinking has become the orthodoxy of the Republican Party at precisely the moment when the racial demographics of the country have shifted. I've shown you the high levels of animosity to Blacks, to Latinos, to Muslims, to gays on the part of a core constituency of the Republican Party, not the entire Republican electorate, but the constituency that supports Donald Trump. I've told you what the authors of that study conclude, but I want to share this with you again because I think it's chilling and extremely important. They say a consistent hatred towards Democratic aligned groups is what differentiates Trump's approval from overall approval of the Republican Party. As social sorting, right? More whites are in the Republican Party, more diverse people are in the Democratic Party. As social sorting promotes both in-group love and out-group hatred. We see that both are used to Trump's advantage. In contrast, it is mainly in-group member positivity that relates to support for the Republican and Democratic parties. This all raises the possibility that the Trump era is ushering in a new normal to American politics, in which support is derived not just from appealing to in-group affection, but from the outright belittlement and denigration of the opposition party and the social groups that comprise its members. When support for a party's candidates come from active hatred for certain social groups, this fundamentally changes how political candidates construct their campaign strategy and messaging. In this new normal of American politics, a candidate's coalition building isn't about finding groups of people who support their cause, but finding people who actively hate and want to harm the other side. The chance of national cross-partisan coalitions recedes as this type of politics proliferates. And so again, to bring the current moment into focus in light of this analysis, right? The idea that the Republican Party is doing everything in its power to block the Biden agenda indicates, right, that we are at an inflection point in our politics where the Democrats are on the cusp of having the capacity to start legislating in a fundamentally different way. And the Republicans are going to do everything in their power to stop that from happening. That as much as we may still be analyzing this in terms of ideology, I think it's much more important to see it in terms of identity, in terms of race. I won't review this again in light of time constraints, but you've seen that Republicans indicate that we should use force to save the American way of life, that it may be necessary to take law into our own hands, that they support strong leaders who bend the rules, that they don't trust elections, and that these results are correlated with levels of ethnic antagonism. And that's really where I want to come down to, where the author, Larry Bartels, who's the person who conducted that research, quotes Francis Lee of Princeton as saying, a racialized party system in an electorate with questionable commitment to liberal values is a troubling development. It is difficult to manage racial tension in a democracy in any case, much less when race becomes a principal line of political cleavage. And so I am suggesting to you that these are in part hopeful times, but in part also dangerous times, that the parties really are dug in opposed conceptions of America, of who belongs, of who deserves full and equal citizenship, and who legislation should be directed to support and benefit, and that we miss the deep underlying logic of partisan competition if we don't pay attention to racial zero-sum thinking. This leads me now to the number of efforts to change and restrict access to the ballot. As I say, there are too many of them to list. 20 pages on the Brenner Center's website of proposed bills, that these bills are sponsored not exclusively, but dominantly by Republicans, that the states in which they have the best chance of passing are states where Republicans are exclusively in control, although New York is now in play also. And there's some indication that if Republican-controlled states engage in aggressive gerrymandering on a partisan basis, New York may try to counter that to restore some of the seats that the Democrats might lose as a result. Reminding you very quickly why gerrymandering can be so effective, That it's possible to divide districts in radically disparate ways, to be very fair and proportionate, to be very unfair and disproportionate, to be very strange and somewhat disproportionate. And that when Pennsylvania did this aggressively in 2010, the result was that in 2012, the Democrats and the Republicans essentially split the vote, but the Democrats got 5 House members and the Republicans got 13. That's despite the fact that the Republicans actually got slightly fewer votes than the Democrats got. This is what's coming if the voting rights legislation doesn't pass Congress. And as I've shown you, Congress is already skewed by partisan gerrymandering, that there are some Democrats who shouldn't be in Congress if things were perfectly proportionate, but there are even more Republicans, and the result makes a difference. There are probably 20 to 30 more Republicans than there should be if the House of Representatives was genuinely representative of the partisan composition of the electorate that elects them. Similarly, when we look at the way in which the Senate and the nature of its disproportionate representation skews the Electoral College, as we all know, winning the popular vote is no guarantee for the Democrats to win. And so our constitutional design and our current system of designing and implementing elections puts us in a position where there is a pathway to success for the Republican Party without reconstituting itself as a majority coalition. This won't last forever, but this is very dangerous this decade. And again, if we could convince some white Americans to abandon zero-sum electoral thinking, I think this strategy would be much less likely to succeed. Let me conclude then with a little bit about zero-sum from Heather McGhee's analysis. And I know I'm running out of time. Let me be very quick about this. So in her book, The Sum of Us, she first of all illuminates the deep, long historical roots of a zero-sum model in American politics. It originates in the fact, of course, that so much of the land of the original colonies was seized from Native Americans. So much of it was cleared by enslaved African American labor. So much of the wealth of our society was generated on the backs of an atrocious institution, the institution of slavery, and atrocities need justifications. And the idea that there's a superior race, there's an inferior race, and that if you don't dispossess the Native Americans, they will go to war with us. If you don't keep the African Americans in chattel slavery, they will rise up against us. That justifies the atrocious treatment of these groups in our history. The second origin has to do with the fact that it was really a very narrow and precarious elite, not the old world aristocracy, but the new world effort to construct a new aristocracy in a democratic society that ultimately legislated zero-sum politics after they saw in Virginia and Georgia and the Carolinas in and around Chesapeake Bay the possibility that indentured Europeans and enslaved Africans would rise up together as they did in the 17th century and overthrow the government of the Virginia colony. They said, we've got to figure out a way to divide and conquer. And what they did was they increased the legal differentiation between whites and blacks in order to secure their elite power and to enshrine in law and social practice the idea of complete and utter division and separation between the races. And then once this has been going on, as it has been going on for nearly 400 years, it becomes a self-reinforcing cycle. It takes root as our common sense, and it becomes integrated into the ways in which we think ourselves and our culture, into the American conception of citizenship, freedom, and equality, not just as something possessed by all citizens, but as something defined against the constant presence of an enslaved or excluded racial minority. Our advantage is valuable in light of its contrast with their disadvantage. That is zero-sum thinking par excellence, and that is deeply woven into our law, our culture, our psychology. And so as I have tried to suggest, that this way of thinking about our politics is extremely illuminating, that over the last 20 years, the period in which first we elected an African American president, and many white Americans found that to be threatening to their status because of zero-sum thinking. And as the support for a more active role in federal government became the Democratic agenda, we have really polarized around race and government activism. I want to show you this as the last piece of data I'll share with you today. This is a study that was done in which they correlated two ideas: the level of racial resentment with the level of support for government spending and government activism. And as you can see, the lower the rate of racial resentment, the higher support for government services and spending. The higher the rate of racial resentment, the lower the rate for the lower the support for governmental services. And alternatively, the acknowledgement that one experiences economic vulnerability or peril is weakly, not strongly correlated the way racial resentment is, but weakly correlated with your willingness to support governmental services. The more you are willing to say, I experience economic precariousness, the more you are willing to say, I also support governmental services. And I hope you can see that in a sense, there is a trade-off between these two. High racial resentment is preventing many of the people experiencing economic vulnerability from supporting governmental services that would actually ameliorate their experience of economic peril. And so when I say that I think this is an important lens through which to view the politics of the last 20 years, it's data like that that leads me to think that this is, if you will, the underground force shaping our politics beneath our ideological battles. Let me point out that in McGhee's analysis, the cost and pathologies of group competition don't just fall on the subordinate group, they fall every bit as much on the dominant group. She looks at some economists at Yale who estimate that if, as opposed to racial divisions in the labor movement and the Democratic Party, we had had racial solidarity, that wages might be 30 to 40% higher in the United States today, that we would likely have universal health care, et cetera. And this is, of course, speculative, but they attempt to do this with fairly precise statistical weighting of the way in which racial division has hampered, handicapped the labor movement and progressive politics in this country. And the final thing then to see is that the US has a weaker provision of public goods than any comparably developed society. That the swimming pool metaphor could be replaced with the cost of healthcare, the availability of the kind of medical care people take for granted in many European societies, the supply of affordable housing, the quality of the public transportation system. We could keep going, but good by good. McGhee puts it, why don't we have nice stuff in this society? And her answer is because we have not worked together in trust, with collaboration and cooperation. And if we started to do that, she suggests our society could quickly become a less mean, a more cooperative, a more supportive society. And so this would be a solidarity dividend to accompany the dignity dividend. My suggestion to conclude for today is that we're on the cusp of possibly passing legislation that illuminates the idea that positive sum thinking is available and beneficial to all Americans in the 21st century. And although we obviously get sucked in to the day-to-day drama of whether Pelosi can herd the cats in Congress to resolution, we shouldn't lose track of these deeper structural forces that are very worrying, very dangerous, but also that hold out for some genuine, hopeful prospects. All right, I will stop there. And I know I went over. I'm sorry, I had a lot to share with you today. Bob, you've been waiting patiently. Go ahead. And I see you, Flossie, also, but let's start with Bob today.
So the word entitlement is a loaded word.
You don't have it. You're not entitled, Flossie, believe it or not.
Let her go, Bob.
Okay.
May I continue? The word entitlement is a loaded word. And when Manchin says that he is withholding his support because he's a little bit fearful of entitlement, that to me says more than that. It's a generational entitlement. It's the entitlement of people of color, that they're entitled more than they deserve to get better health care, to get welfare, even if it's not welfare, even if it's just having some support for being able to get back to work. And so for the first time, I see that when somebody starts to talk about entitlement, immediately I'm triggered and I think, even if he's a Democrat or she's a Democrat, that little bit of, wait a minute, you know, we're a little bit better creeps in. Yeah.
So there are racial resonances and reverberations. Sometimes we call them dog whistles. Sometimes we call them coded terms, right? To so much of our ordinary political vocabulary. And in a sense, you might say entitlement is an innocent and a perfectly fine word, right? It refers to what we as citizens are entitled to. Why shouldn't we be upfront about that? But unfortunately, in 21st century America, as a result of 40 plus years of coded politics, this language can't be separated from submerged racial connotations, right? And this, I guess, is in a sense the takeaway from today's lecture, which is the fight that we're having is not merely about how much we spend or how active the federal government will be. It is much more deeply about who qualifies for equal citizenship and whether our federal government should be in the role of repairing some of the inequality and fostering cross-racial cooperation. Because again, I want to be as clear as possible. There are feedback loops. If you create legislation that benefits equally white working class Americans and urban people of color, they may start to detect their shared interests. And that changes the landscape, the dynamics of American politics. Bob, thank you for being patient. Go ahead.
Thank you, David. All of this, Mike, well, first, let me say that the Heather McGhee book is fabulous. It's extremely enlightening, and I would highly recommend it for everyone.
People I liked were recommending it, and I have to say I was a little bit skeptical. And I've come to be very much a fan of this book. It's not just a book with many powerful stories, by the way, a lot of them about Richmond, California, right? So it talks about where I'm from, but it also has deep historical learning, illuminating analysis of both data and politics. So Bob, go ahead, sorry.
So I absolutely agree on that. What brings me to could you characterize the Build Back Better bill in addressing racial inequality and or the zero sum that you've been speaking of? Are there plans in there that directly address this, or are we hoping that, okay, if we have universal childcare, it's going to be good for both black and white and so on and so forth, and they're going to start liking it?
Yeah, so let me say two things about that. And so the first is that what is absent from this legislation is what was present in almost all federal welfare legislation from the 1930s to the present, which is state administration or other mechanisms to allow for the selective administration of benefits so that they could go to the benefits of whites and not to blacks, or whites and not to people of color, right? And so it is the universality of the legislation that I think stands out in 2021. And then the second thing I want to say is yes, it is the case that this legislation is designed in particular to lift poor people, lift people who are economically marginal and precarious. And if we look at who those people are through a racial and a geographic lens, we see that it is white working class people and primarily urban people and people of color, right? And so to take just one example of the hundreds of things this legislation would do, affordable housing, right? And I think I won't go back, but it's got hundreds of billions of dollars for affordable housing, right? And there is an affordable housing crisis in the United States today. I don't need to say that to people in the Bay Area, you know this, right? But the economic dimension to this has to do with proximity to opportunity, right? And so the most expensive cities in the United States are also the cities with the best jobs, the cities with the best prospects for economic mobility. And if we can get the people who don't have economic opportunity closer to the engines of economic opportunity and mobility, we increase their prospects for social mobility, right? And that's a benefit that redounds to both Black, Latino, recently immigrated, and white working class people. I want to be as clear as possible. This is not reparations for historical racial injustice. We're not there yet. I happen to believe very strongly that we won't be a just and equal society until we have reparations for historical injustice. This legislation does not do that. But the fact that this legislation extends care and benefit to those who are least well off in our society and does it in a racially neutral way is real progress and could pave the way to more future positive sum legislation that doesn't say if Black and Latinos and immigrants benefit, white people have to suffer. It will be manifest in the results of this legislation that is not true in 2020 America.
Except for the pay-fors.
Missed that, Bob. You want to explain?
I said, except for the pay-fors. The way we're going to pay for it is rich, right?
Well, and there is a debate here, right? And then we could go back to a sheer policy debate. Do these big, bold federal initiatives ultimately pay for themselves, right? There's an argument that if it's done smart, it contributes to long-term economic growth, which grows the economy, which increases the tax base, which ultimately pays down the debt that we incurred in 2021 by 2030 as a result of the economic growth. I don't think that's a slam dunk argument. I also don't think the idea that this is irresponsible is a good argument. We've got to actually think through what the models of the growth that this bill would produce and how that relates to how it would be paid for. You know, we also obviously need a more just tax system. Some of that will probably be done by this legislation, not as much as we would like, but at least some.
Okay, thank you.
You bet. And look, I've gone way over. I don't know about you, but I'm getting a little hungry. So I think I'm going to call it a day. It's been very nice being with you guys. I don't know if Amy or Genevieve has shared it with you, but I will. I got to touch wood. If everything works out, I'll be there in a couple weeks. And so I'll be able to see you in person for the first time in a very long time. I'm very much looking forward to it. Take care, everybody. Have good weeks. Be safe and see you next week. Bye-bye.
Thank you, David.
Thank you. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.